There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. And I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere. Come along now. There is more hope somewhere. Well, you know there is more hope somewhere. And I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more hope somewhere. And you know there is more peace somewhere. Oh, I know that there is more peace somewhere. And I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more peace somewhere. And you know there is more joy somewhere. Well, you know there is more joy somewhere. And I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more joy somewhere.
I'm Karen Dorn Steele, today's lay leader. I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spokane. Whether you're in the sanctuary or watching online, it's here that we join together to create a nourishing, liberal religious home with a mission to champion justice, diversity, and environmental stewardship in the wider world, or as we say more briefly, to create community, find meaning, and work for justice. Please take a few minutes now to greet one another and say hello to any newcomers among us. For those joining remotely, please reach out by text or FaceTime with your greetings. We now turn from our informal greetings to formally begin our service by lighting our chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, of our unity and solidarity, of our openness and inclusion, of our community and individuality. May this small flame be our offering of warmth to those who are cold and alone, and a light to those in darkness. May it be a flame that ignites justice in our world and a beacon of hope to those in need. And may it reflect at least a spark of truth wherever truth has been lost, and cast a healthy shadow of doubt where it has been found. We've often heard the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous phrase, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," a recurring theme in the presidency of Barack Obama. But what is also a sobering reality is the frustrating pushback to that arc, seen most recently in the U.S. Supreme Court's annulment of women's constitutional abortion rights, the rise of QAnon conspiracies, the nasty tone of today's politics, and concerted efforts at voter suppression. Joe King, our speaker today, is a talented politician with blue-collar roots. He understands political pushback. As Speaker of the House in the Washington State Legislature, he worked with Democrats and Republicans, with the Republican Senate, by the way, to pass the Growth Management Act and the Washington State Basic Health Plan, which was the nation's first state-sponsored primary health care plan for working families. As a journalist, I sometimes wrote about Joe's legislative leadership, especially with the Growth Management Act, since I was an environmental reporter at the time. After he and his wife, Kelsey Gray, moved to Spokane and joined our church, we become friends. Let's welcome him to our pulpit, which marks the first time that Joe, the former speaker, has ever spoken in a church. Along with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, Joe and I have also, both in our separate careers, drawn inspiration from the late Saul Alinsky, the brilliant community organizer who encountered repeated pushback in his fight for better conditions in slums, factories, and fields. In his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals, Alinsky wrote about the tactics necessary to change the world as it is to the world as it should be. The Prince, he said, was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold on to power. Rules for Radicals, he asserted, was written for the have-nots on how to take it away. Alinsky wasn't a Unitarian, but he could have been. Most important to him was the, quote, free, opening, questing, and creative mind of man. Leery of rigid ideologies on the far right and the far left, he insisted that no ideology should be more specific than these words of America's founding fathers, for the general welfare.
Well, we all need a little help when we're trying to go down the, quote, right path of life. And this is actually one of my favorite hymns. It's a black hymn, and you could call it a spiritual. It's number 348, Guide My Feet. Please stand as you're willing and able.
Race
time we gather as a congregation, there are always those who are with us in our hearts and minds and whom we want to wrap in our love and care. We light a candle this morning for them. We also salute the people of Ukraine for their bravery during the ongoing Russian invasion. And we remember Sandy Williams for her groundbreaking work for racial justice in Spokane. Let's also remember Al Toutaint, who, one of our members who has had a fall and is in care for it. So keep him in your thoughts as well. Let us share a moment in silence, embracing others who are here in our hearts. You are welcome to say their names, those named aloud, and those remembered in the silence we hold in our community of compassion. We now gratefully give and receive this morning's offering, which sustains this community in its mission to the larger world. You will see envelopes with your order of service for this month's special collections. It's for Transitions, a local nonprofit with a mission to end poverty and homelessness. They have several programs, including the Women's Hearth, Miriam's House, the Transitional Living Center, the New Leaf Kitchen, and Home Yard Cottages. You may also contribute online or write a check with September's special collection in the memo line.
Thank you so much. At this point, I'd like to invite any children who are here to come on down for our Time for All Ages. You know, before I took this role, the Time for All Ages came before the offertory, and I made a stink about that and said, I want our children to hear these amazing musicians that we have and our pianist, Maura. So thank you for letting us all hear your sounds. All right, so in your order of service, you might notice that there are plans for Todd and or me to recruit Children's Chapel volunteers from now through October 9th. We started this campaign last week at 9:30. We asked for 6 Children's Chapel volunteers, and by 12:30 last Sunday, we had 6 Children's Chapel volunteers. So thank you for being such a generous congregation. We won't be bugging you anymore from the pulpit, but if you are still interested, you can always reach out to me. So today, we are talking about something pretty important, hope. So I'm wondering, have any of you ever hoped for something? Yes? You hoped to live in fairyland. That sounds like a really fun hope. So, has that hope come true? Yeah, oh good. So, I think that hope is sometimes a little bit like this. Can you tell what this is? You have to use your imagination to picture a little U-shaped nub underneath it. This is an acorn cap. So it's the top half of an acorn. Yes, you find these in fairyland. They turn them into all sorts of things, chairs and cups, hats, exactly. So what do you think an acorn will grow up to be? A fairy? Maybe so. What do you think, Theo? A Pokemon? Maybe. Sometimes special acorns can grow up to be fairies and Pokemon, but most acorns grow up to become oak trees. If I just dropped this acorn right here on the ground, would it turn into a tree? Probably not. What are some of the things it would need to grow into an oak tree? Water, soil, sunlight. I think you covered the bases. Yeah. So, like our acorns here, our hope needs other things to come to life. We have to start with our imaginations. So everybody, close your eyes and just imagine something that you hope for. So your hope, what you're imagining right now, are like these acorns. They need a little work, care, action, help, and luck to really come to life, like an acorn becomes an oak tree. You can open your eyes. I have one last important question. Could you ever have an oak tree without first having an acorn? In our imaginations, maybe. But in our world, we would need this acorn first to get our oak tree. So every great thing that anyone has ever done first began with hope, with someone's imagination of what could be, plus action to make it come to life. And that is the power of hope. And I've got enough acorns for everybody to have one in Children's Chapel today. So if the congregation would like to join me in singing our children out to Children's Chapel, that would be great.
I invite you now into a time of meditation. Make yourselves comfortable, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and on this solemn eve of Rosh Hashanah, which starts this evening worldwide, reflect on these words from a Jewish prayer. Grant us the ability to find joy and strength, not in the strident call to arms, but in stretching out our arms to grasp our fellow creatures in the striving for justice and truth.
Quote from Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way.
We're going to do the Lonesome Midnight Waltz. It's a Bill Monroe composition. In the 1960s, it was a breakthrough piece in the world of bluegrass.
Welcome, everybody that's here, to those listening online, this glorious, glorious fall Sunday. Thanks to all my personal friends that have showed up. I think I'll label them honorary UUs today. I'd like to recognize Betsy Wilkerson, Spokane City Councilman. So thank you so much. Thank you, Karen, for that really nice introduction. But I've been thinking that I want to go back and review the spokesman records. I'd like to see the stories, actually, that you wrote about me back when I was speaker, to see if they were as glowing as the introduction that I had today. I would like to talk about hope today, but I think I'll start with a story about a lack of hope. In a different century, I was an intern teacher in rural Kentucky, an area that was frightfully poor, also frightfully proud. As a West Coast transplant, I quickly gleaned that the reason that they had schools in Kentucky was for the sake of basketball. If we hadn't had basketball, you wouldn't have had schools. It gave the basketball players something to do during the day. Too often, all the hope in the community was pinned on the kind of slim underpinnings of the fortunes of the local basketball team, even junior high teams. An enormous amount of community pride was invested in them. From that experience, I remember a student named Johnny Brown. He was a family of extremely poor parents. As they would say in Kentucky, he was from the head of the holler. That means you're so far off the road that they just don't extend most services. No power, no sewer, no normal power. The roads were almost impassable. Although the labels that would have been used about Johnny back then were much crueler than they are today, Johnny was developmentally challenged. In the 5th grade, he still wasn't reading at a 1st grade level. And at that time in Kentucky, there were no provisions for special education. So a friend of mine, a very caring, very funny, very determined teacher named Sally, made up her mind to work with John after hours. Sometimes she'd work in the school and then drive him up to the head of the holler, drive him home after school. Sometimes she would go out on weekends and work with John and his parents. About this time, Sally had a call from the principal. Sally may have been expecting praise for her work. That's not what she got. The principal told her, "I want you to stop that extra work with John Brown. I'm afraid that you're going to raise his expectations too high and he's going to be more difficult to manage. And besides, you know that boy is never going to amount to nothing." That's a lack of hope. As a relatively new UU, I've concluded that one thing we have in common is our desire to make the world a better place. Seems to be baked into our DNA. The most essential element of making the world a better place is hope. We probably wouldn't be UUs without hope, but in a world that is fraught as the one we find ourselves in, it's sometimes difficult to maintain hope. Given the world we face, I thought it might be timely to talk about the role of hope. I don't think I need to catalog the sources of our angst and anxiety. Karen did. I'll mention a few. We've got we're staring at environmental calamity. We have a political system that on its best days is almost dysfunctional. A war a half a world away, that reminds actually us good liberals that sometimes a strong army is needed. And we're seeing the face of real evil. For me, my personal despair and angst comes from the inability to communicate with those who have different political beliefs. You'll learn that in heart I am an optimist. Well, how can that be? I'll tell you, I am such an optimist that I maintain, in spite of everything that I outlined and Karen outlined, I maintain that the world is getting better every year by any measurable standards. Really? Yeah. I've got evidence of that. The UN puts out an annual report card, Human Development Report, measuring progress in 180 different countries on health, education, standard of living. Turns out, if you want progress, the first thing you better do is educate your women. That's the ground run. But in all 180 countries for 30 years, every measurement is getting better. Since that report was initiated over this 30-year period, now it gets better. Now, as a provocateur, I often throw out this idea that the world is becoming a better place. And almost universally, this is really interesting to me, whether I'm talking to a liberal group or a conservative group, every time I throw that fact out, I get enormous pushback. People just resist that idea. They do not want to believe that the world is getting better. Again, liberals, conservatives, I think maybe the only thing that would unite liberals and conservatives is this view that the world is going to hell. At this point, I'm going to interrupt myself, but I decided to fact check this UN report. And sure enough, actually, the last couple years, things didn't get better. COVID was absolutely as serious and as world-changing as we thought it was. But we're talking about a trend. We're talking about this arc where it is getting better. Too often, people look at hope as a weak remedy. It somehow seems kind of flabby, not very robust, not strong. Remember Sarah Palin? She was attacking Obama's message of hope and change. Remember her sarcastically asking, "And Barack, how is that hopey, changey thing going?" Well, actually, Sarah, that hope thing is doing pretty well. But it takes work. It takes real guts. Hope is not weak. It's strong. It takes courage. I'm no Pollyanna, and neither was Viktor Frankl. Many of you know his story, the story of Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning. He was a trained psychologist sent to Auschwitz in his midlife. His book is the story of his survival under the most inhuman scenarios that any of us can imagine. He and his fellow prisoners were stripped of clothing, fed deliberately starvation diets, because it was cheaper to starve them to death than it was to waste a bullet or a gas on them. And more importantly, they faced every effort to strip them of their humanity and dignity. Now, Frankl was anything but an unrealistic optimist. He details the horrors of Auschwitz and the moral corruption of his captors. He didn't pretend to wish away any problems or pretend that they didn't exist, but he acknowledged their grim reality. Yet in spite of these stories, he describes how holding on to hope was literally a life and death decision. Cigarettes in the camps were the medium of exchange. That was what the prisoners used for money. He obviously didn't have any money. He said that as people gave up hope, they began to smoke up their stash of cigarettes. He said that those who lost hope developed a certain look in their eye, a fatalism that inevitably ended in death. Somewhere else, Frankl said that dying wasn't the hardest part of surviving. It was living. Frankl called on us to become bigger than we believe ourselves to be. Maybe we're in a Viktor Frankl moment. Maybe we need to call ourselves to greatness. The larger the problems facing the world, the greater we need to be, and the more we need to nourish hope. Nourishing hope isn't easy. The best tool, I think, to nourish hope is to reframe the narrative. I'm a big believer in the power of stories. The world turns on stories, and we have an ability to create stories and create different endings. When first faced with a narrative that seems to be leading the world down the wrong path, or facing a personal narrative that seems insurmountable, change the story, reframe the narrative. You don't have to have experienced the horrors that Frankl experienced to recognize the difficulty in maintaining hope. We had a neighbor girl named Janine who lived with her single father in an almost abandoned trailer house. The mother, who'd struggled with drugs, was no longer on the scene. The father was trying the best he could to raise his daughter, but he just didn't have he wasn't equipped with the tools or resources to do this. The girl wandered up our driveway one day and asked to pet the horses. This began a small relationship with Janine. She reduced me to tears one day when she called us and asked, "Can you come to my birthday party?" "Oh, it's okay if you don't." It's okay. It's okay if you don't. That lack of hope broke my heart. More about Janine later. Someone who understands reframing the narrative is Vladimir Zelensky, the former comic, the heroic leader of Ukraine. Do you remember the run-up to the Russian invasion when our experts said that Putin would walk into Ukraine and overrun it in a matter of days? Do you remember that? That was the common wisdom. That Putin would drive right into Kyiv and the Ukrainians would hand over the keys and no one would do anything about it. It wasn't that Zelensky and the Ukrainian people didn't get the message. They got the message and they reframed it. They called upon all their hope and their frustrations and their love of freedom to convince the world that the narrative was wrong and that they would resist and chase the Russians out. They kept hope alive. I've wondered, why did most of us, why were we so willing to buy into the idea, and most of us did, that the experts were right, that Ukraine couldn't successfully resist the big bear? First, history was against them, and our pundits and politicians were looking to recent history. We couldn't imagine the smaller company being successful in resisting. Second, we didn't allow ourselves to hope because we were afraid, at least in my case, I was afraid of looking foolish, of looking ignorant, of not being in the know. Third, just as people don't want to believe that the world is improving, there is something in our guts that leads us to a lack of faith in the future. Somehow we expect the worst. Somehow we get mentally invested in assuming that the world is going to hell. Smarter folks than me can explain why that is. I do know that this tendency to assume the worst outcomes is the enemy of hope and the enemy of human progress. Our midterm elections give us another example of the value of hope. Many of us are worried about our personal freedoms being stripped away. And the conclusion of the pundits were, well, you're going to lose. It's just that time. These midterms you're supposed to lose. The out party of the new president's supposed to lose. Curiously enough, the loss of a personal decision, the Dobbs decision, seems to have galvanized a particular significant part of the electorate. Somehow, the loss of a freedom allowed people to hope that the traditional narrative that we were going to lose just might be wrong. We can't predict the outcome of this election, but surely the recent news and polls can give us the courage to hope and then go to work and make it true. I mentioned earlier that the inability to bridge the vast political difference in our country threatens me with despair. That's my personal sense of angst. So I decided, kind of in the middle of writing out this message, that I was going to try to use my own medicine. I said, Joe, you better change the narrative. So I started imagining successful conversations with people that we look at as political opponents. I would play them out in my mind and think that I could have successful conversations with them. I'm starting to imagine that I can have conversation with those others. Remember, Frankl said, hope is a choice. I'm making a personal choice to imagine that we can find common ground with people who we often characterize as others. While trying to figure out how to bridge this gap, I realized that I was thinking of my political opponents as others. Liberals often think of conservatives. Oh, you don't like people of color, you don't like this because you're thinking of them, you're afraid of the others. Well, to my chagrin, as I thought about it, I was treating my political opponents as others. Now, I can't give you the formula about how I'm going to make this communications leap happen, but I'm working on it. In the midst of thinking about this, I had something happen that had never happened to me before. I had a message from the grave. Kelsey and I attended Sandra Williams Memorial Service along with many of you. For those of you who don't know Sandra Williams, and most of you know of her work, African-American activist, started a black newspaper, the driving force behind the Karl Maxey Center. She had died, if you hadn't noticed, in a recent plane crash over Puget Sound. In her memorial service, which included moving gospel music and stirring memories from her friends, a video was played from Sandra that had obviously been produced before she died in the plane crash. She was being interviewed in her role, about her role in the community. This humble, but very tough, very dedicated, very strong woman was asked about how she got things done. She answered that she thought of herself as a storyteller. She talked about the difference between left brain and right brain. She talked about how ineffective it was to lecture people, to tell them, well, racism is just wrong, that they shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that. She said that doesn't work. She said, appealing to the left brain wasn't effective. She said her stories appealed to the right brain. She said, and this really struck me, change isn't possible until the heart changes. And stories have the power to change the heart. That message from Sandy reinforced my faint hope that I could bridge the gap that I worry so much about, that maybe I could do it with stories, and maybe those stories could change hearts. It's funny that I have known the power of stories, but somehow I hadn't applied it to the issue that I was most worried about. This truly was a message from the grave. Oh, and remember the young woman, Janine? Extremely modest means, who invited us to her birthday party. We had lost track of her. For years, we hadn't seen her and probably hadn't thought of her. We recently had a message from her. She had just opened her own veterinarian practice. She chose hope and not despair. Hope is not sufficient to make the world a better place. But hope for a better future is a pretty good place to start. Thank you.
Well, you might as well keep standing because we're going to sing the last hymn. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the autumn time. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the autumn time. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me. Come walk in rain with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the autumn time. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me. Come share a rose with me, that I might know your mind. And I'll bring you hope when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the autumn time.
As we depart today, I leave you with the words of poet Langston Hughes. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Amen, blessed be, salam alaikum, and shalom.
Hallelujah.